Hey, Oscar fans. The Oscar race is really getting intense. Just ask poor Margot Robbie. She has been pushed out of the Best Supporting Actress race cruelly by Margot Robbie. She has actually replaced herself in the top 5 of our experts' predictions. Her Bombshell role has moved ahead of her Once Upon a Time in Hollywood role. I'm Daniel Montgomery, here with Tom O'Neil, Susan Wloszczyna, and Joyce Eng to talk about that and more developments in this awards race this week. So Joyce, let's start with you. What do you make of this new development in the supporting actress race?
Not surprised at all. Now having seen Bombshell, I feel like that's just a bigger part for Margot. And she has a really killer money scene in the film that I feel like a lot of women, given the topic that the movie tackles with sexual harassment in the workplace. Obviously, the film's about Roger Ailes and Fox News. And it's just a really lovely scene for her, and she nails it. And we've discussed this before, where it like her screen time may or may not be even to her screen time in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but she definitely speaks a lot more in Bombshell, and I feel like that's just going to carry her along further, especially because Bombshell will be the fresher film, and I think the Hollywood afterglow would kind of help her get nominated for one or the other, or she could vote split herself, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think right now her better chance is with Bombshell.
Yeah, it's interesting. 13 experts are now predicting her to be nominated for Bombshell, and 8 experts are predicting still her to be nominated for Once Upon a Time. But she could only be nominated at the Oscars for one. So if you add those two up, there are 21 experts who think she'll be nominated for something, which would put her near the top of the category. Susan, let's bring you in and ask you. What else is changing in this year's Oscar race?
Well, one thing that isn't changing is that, at least in the combined odds, Once Upon a Time is on top now, but The Irishman has the same odds, and that has been going on since early August when the prediction site went up. The one deviant prediction site is All Stars, because they're putting Marriage Story in number 2 and Once Upon a Time on top and Irishman third. But it's still, those two films, The Irishman and Once Upon a Time, really have barely budged from the combined. They've just been switching places most of the time. And Marriage Story 2 is like a solid number 3, so...
And an interesting thing about Marriage Story is that that's also an interesting story in the supporting actress race, because you've got Laura Dern, who's a contender for that, but she's also in Little Women, so a little bit like Margot Robbie, she could capitalize on having 2 roles in the race, and whichever one she gets in for, she might have a better chance of winning with. Well, let's bring in Tom O'Neil now to see what he thinks about Margot and Once Upon a Time and what's happening in these Oscar races.
Yeah, the Margot thing is fascinating because there are such strong pluses and minuses for her candidacy, let's say, in this Oscar race. So her role in Bombshell, as we've discussed in the past, is kind of like a Barbie doll. She's a representative character of like all the women Roger Ailes preyed upon, and so it's kind of a symbolic role, and so they don't really etch her personality broadly, and that's a detriment. The Oscar voters are snobs; they like big pretentious roles. But as Joyce just said, she really nails it here and there with these very emotionally vulnerable, tender scenes, and then has her big money scene, a crying scene that goes on and on, but actually it's actually quite affecting. And so I do now agree that if she's nominated, she's going to be nominated for that. I don't have her in for anything because I don't know what to do. Frankly, tell me what I'm supposed to do.
Well, actually, that's an interesting dilemma and not a new one. We've seen that before, and sometimes it helps. Kate Winslet had 2 roles competing for attention, Revolutionary Road and The Reader. She was actually campaigned as a supporting actress for The Reader, but the Oscars said no, she's a lead in The Reader, and nominated her for that, and she won. Definitely having both roles helped her win. And Alicia Vikander a couple of years ago had Danish Girl and Ex Machina. She got in for Danish Girl. Ex Machina definitely helped her win. But then look back at Scarlett Johansson, speaking of Marriage Story. Her first big shot at Oscars was Lost in Translation, but that year she also had Girl with the Pearl Earring, and Oscar voters were just like you, Tom. They're like, I don't know what to do, so they didn't do anything with her. She didn't get nominated. And now she's back
with 2 roles too, and she can be in both categories this time. So, and
she's distinctly lead and distinctly supporting. So it's not.
Whereas with Margot, it's like they're clearly both supporting. So like voters just need to pick one for her, and then hopefully they'll like carry her the rest of the way. And like that's just the one that everyone settles on.
And also the movie doing quite well in the predictions, I think, helps her too, in that people do like the movie as a whole. And I think, if it's just a performance being nominated, sometimes it can be shaky, unless you're Renee Zellweger trying to make a comeback. So we'll see.
Let's talk about that, because that's the big change that could disrupt this race too. Daniel, I see that you have Saoirse Ronan at number 1. How dare you? Judy Garland, a role from number 1 for Saoirse, but you have your reasons, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Renee Zellweger is fantastic in Judy. I didn't know what to expect from that film when I saw the trailer. Obviously, it's very risky for a very recognizable person like Renee to play someone very recognizable and beloved like Judy Garland. I thought she did an excellent job in the film. But given, how the film has been received, it's really all the Renee Zellweger show. So I feel like she's going to be probably the only nominee for the film, or one of the only nominees for the film. I could see it getting in for costumes or sound or categories like that. But you look at Little Women, I think that's a likelier Best Picture contender for Saoirse, and Marriage Story for Scarlett Johansson, that's a likelier Best Picture contender. So I think those films are going to have broader support overall, and the fact that Saoirse has not won, and she's in that golden age for Oscars where they love to reward sort of these starlets in their 20s who are really kind of blowing up. Jennifer Lawrence won when she was in her 20s. Gwyneth Paltrow, Shakespeare in Love, won when she was in her 20s. Brie Larson was in her 20s. And so she fits that mold. She's been nominated like half a dozen times almost, and she's only 25. So Saoirse Ronan is due. It's a big, juicy, emotional role in Little Women. The embargo's up, and the responses to the film have been great. It's Greta Gerwig's follow-up to Lady Bird, which also starred Saoirse, which Saoirse seemed like a strong possible contender for. So I think the fact that we've seen multiple adaptations of Little Women over the years is probably the biggest detriment. Like, she has to stand out against not only her fellow nominees, but say Winona Ryder like 25 years ago. But I think the path is there for Saoirse Ronan, but I at this point I think it's between her and Scarlett.
Oh, come on! Her and Scarlett, you're just taking the Renee and pushing around. And look, all this baloney of you film snobs, first of all, beating up on the movie Judy. You're wrong. You're wrong about Bohemian Rhapsody last year. You're wrong. The movie is fine. The movie's great. And look, this point you're making is normally a one of these rules we pay serious attention to. In other words, if you are predicting someone's going to win Best Actress, let's say, then it should be a big contender in other categories. But that wasn't the case for Julianne Moore with Still Alice. And if Glenn Close had won last year, it wasn't a good case for the wife. It's not, when it's about the actress and it's Renee and it's Judy, Mike, it's not just anybody. This is the greatest talent in Oscar, in the most tragic story of Hollywood history. So I think that's different. I was very skeptical of Saoirse Ronan.
Won before. That is the difference between her and
Right.
Judy
Kate Blanchett, one in supporting and then one in lead. I don't want to hear that. Look, I take my Judy very seriously, Daniel. Don't cross me. You're dealing with a 65-year-old Judy queen here, and I am not going to give up easily on Renee. But Saoirse is really, really good in Little Women. I agree with you that we were all pleasantly surprised because we were worried about the movie. We had such a beloved premise with a great cast and director and all this. We wanted it to be good, but we weren't hearing any rumblings from behind the scenes. But now that we've seen it, I would say, yes, she's magnificent. Her role is big and wonderful, and she's defiant. That's very important. And you're rooting for her, which is very important. But Daniel, she's Saoirse Ronan on screen. That's the problem. And they often like big transformative performances like Helen Mirren becoming Queen Elizabeth. And that's Renee. So anyway, I do think that Saoirse can win, but she's not going to. Who else has opinions?
I mean, I still have Saoirse in fourth. Like, I really enjoyed her in Little Women. Like, it's the movie itself. It's a very fresh take on the material. It's a far more feminist take, and I do like the structure that Greta utilized with the cross-cutting, although I'm familiar with the book and the movies, so I feel like it was more effective for someone familiar with material, so I don't know how exactly that will play with some people who don't know anything about Little Women, but the last half, or the last act, is like really strong with Saoirse. So I think she's getting nominated. I'm not as confident as Daniel is about a win. I just feel like the competition's really stiff. It's kind of weird because we kind of have this like settled, contenders in like the top 5 or 6. And then there's just kind of like the lower tier of people who you kind of have trouble seeing getting in, maybe like in like the 5th slot. I think after seeing Little Women, Saoirse's in. But I also can see her being like the next Kate Winslet, so we're just talking about her. Like, she's just one of those young actresses who's really respected and consistently puts in great work, and she gets nominated for almost every single one of her projects. But like, they kind of put off awarding her until they like come across like a good year. I'm using air quotes if you're listening, for her, if it's like not too competitive and it's like the right film that they really latched onto, like with The Reader for Kate. Like, people weren't really expecting that to get into Best Picture back when it was still a field of 5, but once she got into lead for that over Revolutionary Road and that got into Best Picture, it was like, okay, this is hers. So I feel like Saoirse might have to wait maybe like a couple more years to finally get that win. So right now I don't see her winning.
Well, I will say that I'm not
going to jump in there first. I'll see back to you that this is what a severe Judy queen I am. I have in my living room here in Los Angeles a giant portrait of Judy Garland that was shot by Milton Green, the guy famous for shooting the Maryland pictures, the Maryland photos. And that was I purchased. That was the property of Truman Capote. I purchased it from his estate, and just want to plant my Judy flag here. Okay, there you go, Daniel. Back to you.
Well, I will say that I'm not confident that Saoirse is winning, but I do think there's room for her to. I do think she's out front at the moment. I do think, Joyce, you make a good point about Kate Winslet. People like she seemed like this grizzled veteran by the time she finally won for The Reader. But like, it's easy to forget that she was only 32 when she won on that her 6th nomination. So Saoirse certainly is in that ballpark of getting nominated constantly in your 20s and finally winning when like you're this kind of elderly 32-year-old veteran of Hollywood. So that is possible, but I do still think that if it's not Saoirse, I think Scarlett has a better path towards that Oscar than Renee, given the fact that Renee has already won. Scarlett's never been nominated. Scarlett has a victory role, a likelier Best Picture nominee. So I think Scarlett Johansson has a due factor. She's been due for a nomination ever since. She's had an IOU for almost 20 years now, ever since Lost in Translation. So
Judy Garland's had one for 70 years. Go on.
Well, I mean,
but she's not the one getting it.
In my mind, she is, and in Hollywood's mind, she is.
Okay, I think that the comeback narrative of Renee trumps Scarlett never winning. So I do think, she's
listen to Susan. She knows what's going on.
Yeah, because people, she was America's sweetheart. She had to say hello. So, I just think what Hollywood did to her, and made her leave for 6 years and come back and do, okay, Bridget Jones' third, movie. But I think this means something more. And it's a very Hollywood thing to do, that to come back and really do a gangbuster performance like this, because this could have gone all wrong in so many ways, and it didn't. And I enjoyed the movie too, but she is the movie for me.
Daniel's not persuaded.
Yeah. I do think this comeback narrative is the strongest thing Renee Zellweger has going for her. If she hadn't won for Cold Mountain, I think she's a lock for this. She can still win. I think when she came back, I remember that first sort of red carpet photo of her. Everyone was like, "Oh, she doesn't look like her." It was so like, indicative of all of like Hollywood sexism in just like one kind of scandal. I'm using air quotes like Joyce did earlier. That I think the fact that she is now in this really strong role, giving a transformative performance, playing a character who is also kind of treated, to put it mildly, shabbily when she was past her sort of Hollywood, her seemingly Hollywood sell-by date. If you're a woman, I think that narrative could push Renee Zellweger through as much as playing a beloved icon and giving a transformative performance. But I still think, until I see her win some stuff on the campaign trail, I'm sticking with the Saoirse Scarlett thing.
I mean, I do agree with you that her comeback narrative is the strongest thing she has going for her next to the performance itself. But I will caution that we may just be overestimating narratives. Like last season, we all thought it was finally going to be Glenn Close after she won the Globe, because she's never won before. And she still lost to a performance that people just liked more. So if voters are just truly passionate about another performance, that like her comeback narrative might not be enough to override that. And especially like Daniel said, if it's like an across the board contender like Marriage Story, like I can still see Scarlett winning. And I feel like she's being underpredicted because it's like really cool to hate on Scarlett Johansson for a lot of reasons. She said some very questionable, problematic things, I don't know if like the industry feels that same way as the internet does feel about her.
Yeah, I think one thing that might convince me to get on the Renee train is because she also had another comeback role earlier this year in this really delicious, campy Netflix limited series, What If? If she starts getting like a Golden Globe nomination for that and a SAG nomination for that, sort of kind of riding the Judy wave, then I might see her make it through. Because that's a very different kind of comeback role where she gets to be this older, sexy kind of villainess, which she sinks her teeth into mightily. That's not normally an awards contender type role, but if we start seeing her get in for that as well as Judy, then I might start to think this is happening.
I feel like people have already forgotten that show existed.
Well,
Daniel, you're going to so regret your predictions. I'm just saying that.
You can change it anytime. That's what we tell people.
We've got a lot of time.
But I'm allowed to hold my grudges in the meantime.
Okay, but like 2 weeks ago, everybody was like, Charlize, and now no one's saying her name. So she's a number 4 among the combined. So
Yeah, I think Charlize has a similar issue that Renee has, where she's won before, so there's not an urgency to give it to her again. She's playing a transformative role, but it's not as outwardly emotional. Megyn Kelly there are a couple of really, strong emotional moments for her in Bombshell, but it's not as outwardly emotive as Renee Zellweger literally crying on a stage trying to sing Somewhere Over the Rainbow.
Margot Robbie in her own movie.
Or Margot Robbie getting a really intense crying scene. So I do think it might be too subtle in this particular race, where you've got fireworks coming from Judy, you've got fireworks coming from Marriage Story and Scarlett Johansson and Adam Driver yelling at each other and screaming and crying, and so it might be hard for something that subdued from a past winner who has gotten her due in that sense too.
Okay, Rami Malek, did he have to cry? No. He had fun most of the time until...
Yeah, but he was playing Freddie Mercury.
I know.
Yeah, he got
the key.
He was not singing on stage, he was lip syncing, but he was still embodying that sort of performance aspect of Freddie Mercury. So I will say that was a pretty showy role.
All right.
Thank you everyone for watching, and thank you Tom and Joyce and Susan for joining me for this. If you think I should be pilloried for not predicting Renee Zellweger for Best Actress, feel free to comment on this video or this podcast if you're listening to it on audio. Make your own predictions and show me up on goldderby.com. You can predict the Oscars, you can predict the Golden Globes, the SAG Awards. You can now predict the Gotham Awards. So there are plenty of opportunities to prove me wrong and prove the rest of us wrong. So thank you for joining us, and we will see you next week.